What's up, cool people? I'm Matt Conroy. Welcome back to our Bible study. Alright, so we've got Leviticus 15 lined up here, and disclaimer, there is some kind of sort of adult content, you might say, within this chapter. I don't really know how else to describe it without getting into too much detail, aside from that. Just note the section heading. Adults will probably know what I mean just from that. Kids, not so much. I would not suggest having your kids read this chapter or listen to this portion of the Bible. Anyway. Leviticus so far has mostly been laws about, like, purity and cleanliness and holiness, and basically a lot of God's expectations and standards for his people and how they were to conduct themselves and especially be, considered clean or pure in God's eyes. Because, the tabernacle, which was somewhat considered his house in a way, they couldn't even necessarily enter the tabernacle if they weren't clean or pure. So, that was where they made their offerings and stuff like that, though. And so there were some important things that happened in the tabernacle that they would want to be able to do. But if they were unclean, then they couldn't go and do those things. So, again, a lot of Leviticus has been laying out what they were supposed to do to be considered clean and pure, and what made them unclean. So anyway, okay. Let's start getting into this here. Leviticus chapter 15. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. Any man who has a bodily discharge is ceremonially unclean. This defilement is caused by his discharge, whether the discharge continues or stops. In either case, the man is unclean. Any bed on which the man with the discharge lies, and anything on which he sits, will be ceremonially unclean. So if you touch the man's bed, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If you sit where the man with the discharge has sat, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If you touch the man with the discharge, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If the man spits on you, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. Any saddle blanket on which the man rides will be ceremonially unclean. If you touch anything that was under the man, you will be unclean until evening. You must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If the man touches you without first rinsing his hands, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. Any clay pot the man touches must be broken, and any wooden utensil he touches must be rinsed with water." So this particular set of verses here just mentions a bodily discharge. It doesn't get into detail too much on what that exactly might be, so there's probably a couple. There's probably a few different possibilities of that, but in any case, even today, for the most part, it's considered, generally speaking, that any bodily fluids or something that is supposed to be in you coming out of you is not necessarily clean. It's actually, a lot of workplaces will consider that like a biohazard of sorts. And there's certain procedures for cleaning that up and making sure that you don't come into contact with it, lest you possibly get infected with something that the other person might have had, whether it's in their bloodstream or saliva or whatever. But yeah, that's pretty much for the most part what this is talking about here, and seemingly most of the chapter will be talking about things of that sort. So yeah, just keep that in mind as we're moving through this chapter here. So yeah, unsurprisingly, God also has deemed these types of things to be unclean. And if someone comes into contact with them, then they're supposed to wash themselves and they're considered unclean until the evening. Which makes me wonder if there's any sort of like domino effect of like, well, if this is unclean, person touches it, they're considered unclean. Do the things that, like, are the things that they touch also then considered unclean, and all that kind of... we haven't heard specifically that there's a domino effect kind of thing like that, but it also hasn't been ruled out, so Anyway. Okay. Moving on to verse 13. When the man with the discharge is healed, he must count off 7 days for the period of purification. Then he must wash his clothes and bathe himself in fresh water, and he will be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day, he must get 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and come before the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle, and give his offerings to the priest. The priest will offer one bird for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. Through this process, the priest will purify the man before the Lord for his discharge. Okay, so 7 days to be considered, pure after, or clean at least, after the discharge has healed, which seems to be kind of a common theme or a common regulation throughout the various instances of things making people unclean, but then those being, gone or whatever. Especially when it comes to, like, diseases or unusual body situations. Like, a couple of chapters ago, it was talking about, like, skin diseases and things of that sort. So, similar kind of thing here, similar waiting time, and then washing to be actually considered clean once the waiting period's done. Somewhat similar offering as well with the 2 birds. Footnote for tabernacle probably just says tent of meeting in the original Hebrew. Purify also says make atonement for. Similar, basically same meaning, just slightly different wording of it in those instances with the footnotes there. I do find it interesting that it specifically notes fresh water here. Which, I mean, obviously you would kind of want the water to be at least some sort of clean in order to make you clean, but it didn't necessarily specify fresh water in some of the previous instances, at least not that I can recall. But anyway, okay. Here's where we start getting into some of the slightly more adult things. But, we're using generally proper scientific terminology here. So, anyway. Okay. Moving on, verse 16. Whenever a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his entire body in water, and he will remain ceremonially unclean until the next evening. Any clothing or leather with semen on it must be washed in water, and it will remain unclean until evening. After a man and woman have sexual intercourse, they must each bathe in water, and they will remain unclean until the next evening. So I assume it says the next evening here because of some of these things generally happening in the evening anyway. Or at least it being more common for it to happen in the evening. So, yeah, anyway. Yeah, like I said, kind of adult stuff here, but that's just a like, okay, clean yourself, clean your clothes, wait a day and you're good. Unlike some of the other things that we talked about previously. Footnote. Okay, so the Hebrew just says until evening. I guess the translators for this version, which is the New Living Translation, went with the next evening, probably assuming that, like, yeah, some of these things are kind of more common in the evening. Like, since we're already on the topic of this kind of stuff, I would figure, an emission of semen might be along the lines of what could be considered a wet dream. It just, yeah. And then, especially back in those days, it probably would not have been as common for, a man and his wife to engage in intercourse just smack dab in the middle of the day, because they were probably going about their daily duties until the evening. So that's probably why the translators for this version decided to say the next evening. Anywho, okay, that's enough rambling on about a smaller detail in this chapter. So, verse 19. Whenever a woman has her menstrual period, she will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her during that time will be unclean until evening. Anything on which the woman lies or sits during the time of her period will be unclean. If any of you touch her bed, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If you touch any object she has sat on, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. This includes her bed or any other object she has sat on. You will be unclean until evening if you touch it. If a man has sexual intercourse with her and her blood touches him, her menstrual impurity will be transmitted to him. He will remain unclean for 7 days, and any bed on which he lies will be unclean. So, there was actually mention of this somewhat in passing a couple chapters ago when it talked about childbirth. I think that was chapter 12. It mentioned, a time period of the woman being unclean, as in or as during her menstrual period. But, it hadn't even gotten into this yet. So, the order of that is a little bit odd, but it's not like we necessarily needed this bit to understand that bit, because it was just breaking down the timing of it. So, again, this is probably, I guess, considered closer to the whole, bodily discharge kind of thing, at least for the woman. And so, it still seems to be holding steady, consistent, and true that, things coming out of you that might not normally be, are, a little more significant, have a longer waiting time to be considered clean again. Touching those things, it's still just the same, okay, wash yourself and you'll be unclean until the evening. And, if you come into contact with anything that they came into contact with, same deal. Anyway, moving along, I suppose, to verse 25. If a woman has a flow of blood for many days that is unrelated to her menstrual period, or if the blood continues beyond the normal period, she is ceremonially unclean. As during her menstrual period, the woman will be unclean as long as the discharge continues. Any bed she lies on and any object she sits on during that time will be unclean, just as during her normal menstrual period. If any of you touch these things, you will be ceremonially unclean. You must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. So this particular section brings to mind a story in the New Testament about a particular woman who was dealing with a discharge of blood for years. And she kept seeking treatment, but it wouldn't go away. And as Jesus was passing by, she, figured he has power to heal. And so, she wanted to just reach out and touch the hem of his robe. And she figured that would be enough to heal her. And long story short, yes, her faith, according to his words, her faith healed her because she believed that it would, and because Jesus. But yeah, so just the connection here, though, being considered unclean like this for so many years, not being able to really have the same kind of interactions with anybody around her as some people would. Or even, she straight up could not go to the temple, probably. I would assume the temple, once it was built, was a similar deal to the tabernacle as this is written. So, probably couldn't even go to the temple during that whole time for years and years. Not able to, give any offerings. Not able to, seek out a priest for any reason, basically. So, yeah. Because of these kinds of regulations, there were significant limitations on what that woman could do. So it really must have significantly affected her, which makes the healing from Jesus all the more powerful. But anyway, okay, sidebar done. Moving along. Verse 28. When the woman's bleeding stops, she must count off 7 days. Then she will be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day, she must bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and present them to the priest at the entrance of the tabernacle. The priest will offer one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. Through this process, the priest will purify her before the Lord for the ceremonial impurity caused by her bleeding. Again, that was, what was the normal case. It was okay, once it heals, you go to the priest, you make this offering, boom, you're good. But in her situation, it didn't stop until she touched Jesus' robe, or whatever garment it technically was. So, yeah, anyway. Otherwise, again, similar process here to the whole bodily discharge mentioned above. Okay, then. I don't really have any other thoughts for that section, so we'll get to verse 31 here and wrap this up. This is how you will guard the people of Israel from ceremonial uncleanness. Otherwise they would die, for their impurity would defile my tabernacle that stands among them. These are the instructions for dealing with anyone who has a bodily discharge. A man who is unclean because of an emission of semen, or a woman during her menstrual period. It applies to any man or woman who has a bodily discharge, and to a man who has sexual intercourse with a woman who is ceremonially unclean. So, just kind of summarizing that, yes, this is important. Can't have people defiling the tabernacle because of things like this. So, yeah, we want to make extra sure that these procedures are followed. And again, emphasizing that the people who are considered unclean in these situations could not go to, certainly not enter the tabernacle. In fact, I think it mentions, with regard to the offerings, that they're supposed to be presented at the entrance. Yeah, at the entrance of the tabernacle. And let me make sure that it's the same on here in this portion. At the entrance of the tabernacle. So they weren't even really considered clean enough to go in. They had to present the offering to the priest at the entrance because they weren't considered clean yet. So anyway, okay. I think that's about all I've got for thoughts on Leviticus 15. All right, so that was it's rather an awkward chapter, if I'm honest. But, you know, it's still a continuation of the idea of staying pure. So if you're staying pure and clean, you got to know what stuff to avoid. And I would say this is definitely some stuff to avoid. But anywho, yeah, not much else I want to say about that. So, as always, like and share if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe and click the bell to get updates when I post new videos to the channel. Feel free to look down in the description to get info on my other social media pages, and leave comments below that with any thoughts you have. So, that's going to do it for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you for the next video. But until then, stay cool, people.